Hi, Achim here from InnerSpace Explorers. Today we want to talk about solo diving, fear, reasons for fear, reasons for solo diving, reasons against solo diving, etc. This came up due to a couple of questions that came on my Patreon account. As you know, there's a little bit more going on than here on YouTube on a more private level, and based on my last project, the Cestus project, I had one of my patrons asking me about solo diving, and I made a patron-only video about that. And there was an answer to that video on Patreon that I thought gives a perfect baseline for a more in-depth video about this topic. So before I get into that, if you like my channel, please hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you get an update once I upload new content, which normally is once a week. So, the original question about the solo diving was why I dive solo on dives like the Cestus. If you haven't seen the project yet, I put a link in the description. And so that was a wreck dive, 108 meters, and I did that solo. And so I explained a little bit on that video why I did it and so on. And then I got this question. Still, my question would be, how do you define the limit of frequent solo diving in terms of distance from shore, returning point, and depth? You'll say according to fear, training, open circuit, CCR, etc. And there's no definite answer to that. So there's a lot of factors that that get into these decisions. So depth, in my opinion, is not a real factor pro or contra solo diving. So if you talk about deep air diving or stuff like that, yeah, for sure. But if you follow the rules, the diving rules, so to speak, regarding O2 levels, narcosis, choose the proper gas, do proper decompression, have the proper bailout, the depth shouldn't be a real issue. So I think it's, for example, way more safer to do a solo 60-meter trimix dive than do a solo 60-meter air dive, something like that. I think you get the point. Another one is distance from shore. So again, that really depends. So I can take my little inflatable 4-meter boat and go half a mile offshore, anchor the boat and do a solo dive, or I can be in a proper capable offshore boat with 2 engines and can be 15 miles offshore and do a 108-meter dive like I did a couple of weeks ago. And now let's think about the risk involved in these two activities. I mean, I'd prefer to be on that offshore boat with a experienced captain that's probably a diver himself and giving me a certain amount of backup than having my little dinghy anchored in 15 meters of water half a mile offshore, because it gives me better support. And in case something happens, I'm not on my own in that little inflatable, but on a proper boat with proper engines, certain speed, probably better equipment, etc. So talking about distance from shore regarding potential risk, there's only 2 things that really come into play. The first thing is you get a really bad DCS issue. So, and then again, do you want to be in that little inflatable on your own, half a mile offshore, or do you want to be in that proper boat that probably has proper oxygen, that has a captain that's functioning, and that can bring you to shore relatively fast in a stable environment? I mean, if you have a bad one, you probably need a helicopter anyway, so then it doesn't really matter. But if, for example, the helicopter is not available, then I would prefer to be further offshore in a proper boat with proper equipment and somebody that can help me instead of being on my own close to shore in that little boat. The other thing would be lost at sea. So lost at sea, again, if that little boat's anchored there and I'm on my own and I'm lost at sea, I have to rely on somebody noticing that I'm lost and then maybe launching a search and finding me, whilst having my boat and my captain having a certain schedule, knowing when I should come back to the surface. Somebody is realizing, okay, the guy's over time, let's go and have a search, etc., etc., etc. So again, I would probably prefer again to be on that better boat further offshore. And at the same time, these examples also clearly show that the solo diving thing is heavily based on proper preparation, proper planning, and a proper execution of the plan. So just jumping into the water somewhere to just have a look is always not such a good idea. And of course, you need to have a certain amount of experience to be able to make an educated decision on the risk of the dive and have a healthy relationship with yourself. I'll explain that in a minute. Because the major term in this entire discussion is fear. And Felipe, who asked this question, actually says, according to fear training, open circuit CCR, etc. So open circuit CCR, in my opinion, doesn't make a big difference. So that's something I wouldn't take into account if you're properly trained on either or. Actually, the CCR gives you more bailout options than open circuit does. So fear, in my opinion, is the most important factor. There's actually two videos, one on solo diving and one on fear, and I'll link them in the description. Probably a little bit a different approach on both topics, and they're both a couple of years old, but nevertheless, if you want to check them out. So if somebody tells me he has no fear, or doesn't experience any fear, that person should not solo dive. Probably that person shouldn't dive at all. So I think fear is super important, and it's probably the most important, I would almost say, skill that keeps you alive, because fear and the proper way to handle it is what makes you back away from situations that might be really, really bad for you. So fear has a very negative meaning for a lot of us and a lot of cultures, and I think this is super wrong. It's very important that when you dive, that you allow yourself to have fear and to think about that fear. Fear doesn't mean you scream away and you start to panic. Then you're far beyond that point where you experience fear. Then you try to ignore it or try to overcome it for some weird reasons, because you think it is wrong to be afraid, or you have to prove something to yourself or to others. And then that completely goes in the wrong direction. You need to realize, okay, this frightens me. And then you need to think, okay, is that a fear that has substance? So is there something that is a danger? Or is it just my brain playing games on me? And even if it is just your brain playing games on you, like being in that dark quarry at night and looking over the shoulder every single time if the monster's coming, if that makes you really afraid, you should go out there. You should abort that dive at a certain point. So if that happens to you on a dive and there is substantial fear where you're like, this is not for me, then you need to go out, and then nothing will happen. So if you do not have that fear, then probably something's wrong with you anyway. Or if you do not allow yourself to experience that and handle it, you may run into a situation that you cannot handle it, that then leads to an accident. So to get back to the original question, there is no definite answer. It really depends on the diver, on his skill set, on his experience, on where he or she is diving, what the conditions are. Is there sufficient surface support, like on the boat, like I said previously. But I hope this gives you a little bit better idea of how I look at the topic and how I approach it, and probably that helps you as well when you come to this decision. So if you have more questions, comments, whatever, please put them in the comment section. Thanks, Felipe, for the question and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about that. So my patrons, anyway, we continue our discussion on Patreon. If you want to check that out, click on the link. It's a super nice community, and we discuss things a little bit more on a private level. And other than that, stay safe, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.